Her journey to understanding, to change, and to genuine are the road stretched out before me like an endless black ribbon, disappearing into the night. Only the headlights cut a narrow line through this impenetrable darkness, and the rustle of the wind, penetrating through the slightly open window, was the only sound that broke the dead silence. I drove with that relaxed slowness when you're not in a hurry, but my thoughts were tensely tangled, like threads in an old ball. The work week had merged into a single gray spot, and now, finally, this moment had come. The road home, where only four walls and a pulsating emptiness awaited me. I couldn't stop thinking about how predictable my life had become. The morning began with the same cup of coffee, the same route to work, the same faces in the office, a ritual repeated day after day, as if someone had locked my world in a time loop. Even the upcoming weekend didn't inspire. Alone or with friends, what difference did it make? It seemed that everything around had lost its taste. Suddenly, somewhere in the distance, I noticed the flickering of red and blue lights. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. But when the light began to approach and the siren cut through the silence, it became clear. This was reality. A police car flickered in the rearview mirror. I automatically glanced at the speedometer. Nothing criminal. However, my heart began to beat a little faster. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, pulling the car over to the side of the road. The muffler exhaled its last breath, and silence fell. I was still holding the steering wheel, gripping it tighter than necessary. This moment always threw me off balance, making me feel guilty, even if I hadn't done anything. My palms were slightly sweaty, and I took a deep breath, trying to calm the unwanted excitement. I noticed someone getting out of the patrol car. As she approached, I realized it was a woman, tall with a bearing that spoke more than any badge or uniform. Her steps sounded distinctly on the asphalt, like the beats of a metronome. She stopped at the window and looked straight at me. Her eyes, sharp, attentive, seemed to try to read me faster than I could say anything. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was firm but not devoid of humanity. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" I shook my head, hoping my movements wouldn't betray a slight tremor. "Honestly, no, officer." My voice sounded steady, but somewhere inside it, there was uncertainty. She slowly nodded, as if expecting me to add something else. Then she opened a notepad and wrote something down before looking up again. "You were speeding by 15 miles. It's quite dangerous here." I swallowed. Speeding? I hadn't even noticed. "I'm sorry," I exhaled. I must have been lost in thought. She didn't react, just wrote something else in her notepad. My attention involuntarily slid to her face. Her calmness, composure, it all evoked a strange feeling, as if I were a small screw in a carefully tuned system that she controlled. "Stay here," she said briefly and headed back to her car. I watched as her figure disappeared into the darkness and felt a strange relief at being left alone, if only for a moment. But what was in her gaze didn't let go. Something elusive, hidden behind a professional mask, made me wonder what was really hidden behind that calmness. When she returned, she had a ticket in her hands. Handing it to me, she stopped her gaze on me again. Her eyes lingered a little longer than necessary. Electricity seemed to pass through the air between us, making me forget what to say for a moment. I took the ticket and looked at it. But I noticed something unusual. On the back was a phone number. Neatly and clearly written, it immediately caught my attention. My heart skipped a beat. Why? When I looked up, she was already heading back to her car, not looking back, not explaining, just leaving. The car pulled away, leaving me alone with this strange find. I stared at the ticket in my hands for a long time, torn between growing curiosity and an inner voice telling me it was all a ridiculous coincidence. But it wasn't just a number, it was a question I had to answer. At home, I couldn't calm down. Lying on the couch, I turned the ticket over in my hands as if hoping it would reveal some new truth. The phone number written on the back seemed out of place, almost absurd. Why had she left it? Was it a mistake or a deliberate gesture? Every thought bumped into another, like waves in a storm. Her voice, calm and firm, echoed in my head. I tried to build a logical chain that would explain her action, but each time I hit a dead end. This woman, a police officer, didn't seem like someone who acted impulsively. What if it was a joke? My mind sought a way to devalue the situation. Maybe she respect for others had begun here. And although the road ahead was long, she knew she was now moving in the right direction. An hour passed, then two. I tried to distract myself, turned on the TV, scrolled through my phone, even picked up a book. But nothing helped. The number, written in neat handwriting, seemed to burn a hole in my consciousness. In the end, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the phone, and before I could change my mind, I dialed the numbers. My fingers were trembling, and my heart was beating so loudly it seemed the whole world could hear it. At the last moment, I stopped, looking at the screen. "What am I doing?" I whispered, erasing the number, but the thought of finding out the truth wouldn't let go. I dialed it again and pressed call. The rings seemed endless. 1, 2, 3. Then the line clicked. "Hello." The voice on the other end was warm, even a little surprised. It was her. I froze. My breath stopped for a second, and a low hum filled my ears. I didn't know what to say. Why had I called? What had I expected to hear? This is the guy you gave a ticket to today." My voice trembled more than I wanted it to. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, which only intensified my excitement. Then I heard a soft laugh. "I didn't think you'd actually call," she said, her tone playful, but with a hint of mystery. "Honestly, I didn't think I'd have the courage to dial." I smiled, trying to lighten the atmosphere. "Courage? Well, then I should be flattered," she replied. "So why did you call?" This question caught me off guard. I expected anything but directness. Why had I called? Because her action hadn't left my mind. Because I wanted to understand what was behind it. Because I want to understand. I exhaled. "Why did you do it?" "Leave your number?" Another pause. I could hear her breathing, soft and calm, before she spoke. "Maybe because you seemed interesting to me." Her words were unexpected, but there was no hint of a joke in them. My heart skipped a beat. Interesting? Suddenly, I was overwhelmed by a wave of nerves and joy at the same time. I didn't know where this was going, but suddenly it didn't matter. "Then maybe we should meet," I blurted out before I could get scared. This time, her pause was even longer. I was already starting to doubt that I had done the right thing when I heard her answer. "Okay," she said, and I felt the tension ease. "Let's meet tomorrow, in the city center, at the cafe on Pine Street, at 7. Don't be late." And with those words, she hung up. I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, staring into space. What had just happened? Tomorrow I was supposed to meet a woman I had known for only a few minutes, an officer who had turned a ticket into an invitation. And the most amazing thing, I didn't feel afraid, only anticipation. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. The night had passed in an anxious mix of anticipation and worry. Looking at the clock, I realized that only a few hours had passed since I went to bed. The words from yesterday kept playing in my head. Breakfast was a formality. I barely tasted the food, focused on the upcoming meeting. As the evening approached, I stood in front of the mirror, trying to pick out clothes. Nothing too formal, but not too casual either. Everything seemed either too stiff or too relaxed. In the end, I chose a simple shirt and jeans, a neutral look that wouldn't scream either too much effort or indifference. The cafe on Pine Street turned out to be small and cozy. There was a faint smell of freshly brewed coffee and barely audible music, creating an atmosphere of comfort. I entered, scanning the room, and immediately spotted her. She was sitting by the window, the evening sun softly illuminating her face. She was wearing a leather jacket and jeans, which looked simple but emphasized her confidence. She noticed me, and her lips curved into a slight smile. "Hi," I said, approaching her table. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting." "You're even a little early," she replied, her voice playful. "Have a seat." I sat down across from her, and for a moment there was a silence that, contrary to my expectations, didn't feel awkward. We both looked at each other, as if trying to read each other's thoughts. "So," she began, crossing her arms on the table, "do you still want to know why I left you my number?" I smiled, feeling the tension ease. "I think so, but now I'm glad you did." Her smile widened, and there was a hint of satisfaction on her face. Then maybe it was the right choice. The conversation began to flow easily, like a river. We talked about work, about what bothered us, about the strangeness and joys of life. She told me about her service, about how hard it is to be a police officer in a city where people look at you with either distrust or fear. I shared my own experiences, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly heard. Her laugh was soft but infectious, and every time she laughed, I caught myself wanting to hear that sound again. Her manner was simple, but there was strength in it. This was a woman who knew what she wanted but wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. By evening, the cafe began to empty, but we still didn't want to leave. The conversation shifted from light topics to deeper ones. She shared stories from her childhood, remembering how she dreamed of becoming an officer to protect people. I listened to her, captivated by how her eyes came alive when she talked about her dreams. When we finally got up to leave, I realized I had spent one of the most meaningful evenings of my life. We stepped out into the cool evening air, and I paused for a moment, looking at her. "Thank you for this evening," I said. "It was unexpected." She looked at me with a slight smile. "Sometimes unexpected things are the best," she replied. We exchanged numbers again, this time just in case one of us decided to take the next step. And as I walked to my car, I felt that this evening was just the beginning of something bigger. The following days flew by in a haze. I found myself waiting for her messages or calls more and more often. Our conversations gradually turned from polite exchanges into something more. She shared thoughts that she seemed to keep deep inside. I felt our connection growing stronger. One evening, as I was about to go to bed, my phone vibrated. It was a message from her. "How do you feel about taking a walk tomorrow evening?" No cafes, just a walk. I smiled. A walk? That sounded simple but somehow warm. I quickly typed a reply. "Sounds great. Where and when?" Her response came almost instantly. "Meet me at the city park at 7. Bring a jacket, it might be cold." The next evening, I arrived a little early. The park alley, surrounded by streetlights, was flooded with soft light. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves on the trees, creating an atmosphere of tranquility. I waited for her, feeling a slight excitement. When she approached, I was once again struck by how confidently she moved. Her step was firm but relaxed. She was wearing a dark jacket, her hair tied back in a ponytail. She looked simple but attractively restrained. "Hi," she said, stopping in front of me. "Ready for a walk?" Of course," I replied, trying to hide a slight nervousness. We walked along the alley talking. She told me about her observations of people, about how sometimes she just wanted to disconnect from her role as an officer and be an ordinary person. Her openness was astonishing. She was revealing a part of herself that remained hidden from others. At some point, she stopped by a small pond. The water shimmered in the moonlight. We stood in silence, enjoying the moment. Several weeks had passed since that walk in the park. Those weeks had been a real revelation for me. Alexa and I spent more and more time together, and with each meeting, I felt an invisible bond growing stronger between us. Her presence had become something I couldn't imagine my days without. She was there, as if she had always been a part of my life. We met on a Friday evening in the small cafe that had become our usual spot. It was quiet there, and the cozy atmosphere allowed us to talk about anything. Alexa had arrived a little earlier than me. I noticed her through the glass doors. She was sitting at a corner table, lost in her thoughts. Her long hair lay freely on her shoulders, and there was a slight smile on her face. I lingered for a moment at the entrance, just admiring her. "Hi," I said, approaching the table. She looked up and smiled. "Hi, have a seat. I've already ordered coffee for both of us." I sat down across from her and looked at her. There was a special sparkle in her eyes that I had begun to notice more and more often. It was a mix of confidence and something else that I couldn't explain. "How was your day?" I asked, prompting the conversation. She shrugged. "Ordinary. But now I understand that these evenings with you are what I look forward to the most." Her confession caught me off guard. My heart beat faster, but I tried to stay calm. "Me too," I replied, smiling slightly. "Every time we meet, it's special." We sat, enjoying our coffee, talking about work, about life. But I felt that something would change that evening. There was something in her gaze, in her behavior, that made me think she wanted to tell me something important. As the cafe began to empty, she suddenly suggested we take a walk. We stepped out into the cool evening air. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars passing by, providing a backdrop for our conversation. "Do you remember that evening when we met?" she asked unexpectedly. I nodded. "Of course. That's hard to forget. You were so confident and, honestly, a little scary." She laughed. "And you seemed unexpected to me. I don't know why I left you my number. It wasn't my style." I stopped and looked at her. She was speaking seriously, her eyes filled with emotions. "But now I think it was the right decision," she added, smiling. "You've changed my life, Jeremy." Those words hit me like thunder. I hadn't expected such a confession. My heart beat faster, and I realized I had to respond. "Alexa," I began, taking a step closer to her, "you've changed my life too. You've given me something I haven't felt in a long time, meaning every day spent with you makes me happier." She looked at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. But they were not tears of sadness, rather of relief. "I thought you might say that," she said softly. "And you know what? I feel the same way." At that moment, the whole world seemed to stand still. I took another step towards her, and before I could think about what I was doing, I took her hand. She didn't pull away. Her fingers gently squeezed mine. "Thank you for calling me then," she whispered. I smiled. "Thank you for giving me your number." We stood like that for a few more moments until the cold wind made us continue our walk. But now everything was different. We held hands, and every word we said to each other sounded deeper than just a conversation. It was an evening that changed everything. After that evening, everything changed. Alexa and I stopped looking for reasons or justifications for our meetings. Every moment spent together seemed like a natural continuation of what had begun that night on the empty road. She had become a part of my life, and I of hers. We spent the next month exploring each other and our shared dreams. We walked the streets of the city, talked about the future, shared memories. She told me about her work, about how sometimes it's hard to cope with the emotional burden that comes with being a police officer. I saw in her eyes how much she had been through, and I tried to be there to support her. One evening, we were sitting on the roof of my house. It had become our new favorite place. From there, you could see the city, its lights twinkling in the darkness. We were wrapped in a blanket, and I was holding her hand. There was a sense of something important in the air, and I felt that this moment would be remembered forever. "You know," she began, looking at the horizon, "I always thought that my job was all I had. I thought it was my only way to do something meaningful." I looked at her, feeling that she was speaking sincerely. "And now?" I asked. She turned to me, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Now I understand that meaning can be found in the little things, in simply being with someone who makes you better. Jeremy, you've changed my perspective on life." I didn't know what to say. Her words touched my heart. Instead of answering, I pulled her closer and felt her relax in my arms. "You've changed me too, Alexa," I said softly. "I no longer feel stuck in a routine. You've given me a purpose that I didn't even know I was looking for." We spent the rest of the evening simply enjoying the moment. No words were needed because everything we wanted to say had already been said. The next day, we decided to go beyond our usual walks and meetings. I suggested a trip out of town to a place where there would be no noise of the city and bustle. We went to a small house by the lake, surrounded by trees and silence. That place became our refuge. There, far from everything, we could be completely ourselves. One evening, sitting by the campfire, she suddenly looked at me with a slight smile. "Do you think this is forever?" she asked. This question was simple, but I knew there was much more behind it. "I want it to be," I answered honestly. "I don't know what awaits us, but I know one thing. I don't want to lose this." She nodded, and in her eyes I saw the same confidence. "Me too." Those words solidified what we both already knew. We weren't just randomly meeting. We were two people who found each other at the right moment. And although there might be difficulties ahead, we were both ready for them. When we returned to the city, everything seemed a little brighter. Every day became something I looked forward to. We began planning the future, small steps that would lead us to something bigger. We were no longer afraid to share our dreams and build them together. Several months passed, and one evening, sitting in that same cafe where it all began, I looked at her and realized I had never been so happy. She noticed my gaze and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. I smiled back. "About how it all started, and about how grateful I am for this chance." She reached across the table and took my hand. "It started unexpectedly, but I'm glad it happened this way. You've made me happy, Jeremy." It was a simple moment, but it held everything. We looked at each other, understanding that the future was something we would build together. And although life might bring us challenges, we knew that now we had what would help us overcome them: each other.